Across its history, Britain's often prided itself on its moral superiority to its mainland European neighbours. Yet a recent story that we're the whiplash capital of Europe, with a cabal of fraudulent claimants, greedy lawyers, claims management firms and supine insurers making money from an always difficult to detect car injury, seemed to throw into doubt British belief in its own moral righteousness. Even the Prime Minister has pledged action to cut such whiplash claims. So are we a country of petty dishonesty, hustlers and scammers from top to bottom? Well, to argue about the morality of Britain, I'm joined by Professor John Milbank, author of Theology and Social Theory, by the Times columnist Oliver Kamm, and down the line from Washington by the historian Tim Stanley. John, if I might start with you, do you think there are more petty thefts, more dissembling, more false claims generally? Do you think, in a sense, if there is that, is there an explanation for it?
Well, I don't know the facts, but I find it perfectly believable, because I think it's possible that Britain is further down the road of modernity than either continental Europe or the United States. We're more socially disembedded from communities than the continental Europe, and we don't have the constraint of religion that the US has. And I think broadly there might be three reasons for this. First of all, I think there's a huge disjunction between expectations of public and private behaviour. So in the public realm, we're just encouraged to pursue competitive advantage, more and more money, instrumental goals, and we think this won't have a carryover into people's public behaviour either at work or at home. And of course it really does have a carryover. But this isn't to condemn people. I think people feel incredibly alienated from their workplaces and so on, and so they tend to try and, you know, game them as far as possible, rip things off, and this is kind of understandable. You know, they lack power. And if quickly I could just say two other things. I think we've got a lack of a kind of narrative that tells us that good and evil are part of the fabric of reality. Instead, we're just kind of Darwinian survival machines. And finally, I think we've become kind of strangers to each other. Foreigners notice we're discourteous. You know, Dante says that courtesy is bending to the will of the other, but we no longer know what our common purposes are, what we expect from the roles of other people. And I think those three things add up to why, indeed, we may be becoming more immoral than anybody else.
Oliver?
I find it very implausible to suppose that Britain and other advanced industrial democracies are decreasingly moral. Certainly compared with even a generation ago, I think we are a very much more civilised society in important respects. We are more open to foreigners, more tolerant. We're more concerned about value pluralism, not moral relativism, which is a separate question, but a pluralism of values. And where there may be pilfering and petty dishonesty, it's part of life, because there will periodically be thrown up perverse incentives, either on a small scale, let's say MPs' allowances claims. I don't mean that the issue is small, I mean that the number of people was small, or on a very large scale, the banking collapse that was brought about by perverse incentives to take on debt.
John?
I don't really understand what you're saying. I mean, if there's only a plurality of values, then there really aren't any values. And of course, we can only be nasty to each other because we share nothing in common, which is increasingly, obviously, what's happening.
We share common citizenship under the rule of law, and under that constraint, we choose the good for ourselves. I'm not concerned about the loosening of social bonds.
So good doesn't really exist. These are only formal bonds. It isn't really the good. This is just right. It's quite a different thing.
I invite the tolerance of the listeners. Did I say that, or did I imply it? I quite patently didn't. I said that the loosening of social bonds was generally a good thing, particularly with the decline of religion, so that we choose the good for ourselves rather than have a set of arbitrary constraints.
So we just make it up, do we?
I'm much more concerned with critical inquiry and thinking things through. And Professor Milbank is, funnily enough, an exemplar of what I mean, as he's a 9/11 truth campaigner, a conspiracy theory. Oh, yes, you are.
All right, I love that homonym on radio. It's very good, but we've got a third person down the line from Washington. So can we let a whiff of history into this conversation, Tim? You know, petty dishonesty, hustlers. Sounds to me like 18th century London, actually.
Absolutely. I would say that I agree that the English are a pretty nasty bunch. That's why I've...
So the English, not the British?
Okay, the British in general. But I agree they're a pretty nasty bunch, because that's why I'm in America. I've kind of run away from them. But I would argue that it's nothing new. It's a return to form. If you go back to Georgian society, you'll find a society which, by the way, did not regulate sexual behavior through laws, didn't have the kind of complex laws that we have today, but which was extremely litigious. People sued each other very regularly. That was a perfectly normal thing to do. People committed fraud. Smuggling was rife. It was very easy to bribe your way out of a difficult court case because magistrates were just basically aristocratic volunteers who were out to make a bit of money. And a good example of the extraordinary degree of corruption across all levels of Georgian society was the South Sea Company bubble, which occurred in 1720. This is something which is very similar to what happened with the credit crunch, but even more nakedly corrupt, where a company sold shares at fraudulently exorbitant rates, really beefed up the value of those shares far beyond what they were worth, to the point where you got a speculation bubble that burst and people lost tens of thousands of pounds. So I would argue that what happened in Britain is in the 19th and early 20th centuries, we created a bit of an artificial myth of the British as being polite, nice, well-mannered and into public moral probity. But really what's happening in the 21st century is we're returning to our more decadent and corrupt past.
John?
Well, this sounds as if there's some theory of nature going on here. The point is, in the 18th century, we were already on the cutting edge of modernity, and that's why there was this collapse of shared virtue. But in the 19th century, there was a huge revival of religion and a return of notions of virtue and honour. Now that has all collapsed again. I think that's the tricky
Oliver,
thing.
are you persuaded of the notion that, as it were, there are peaks and troughs, that what has been said by Tim, which is during the 18th century, as it were, it was trumpeted in the 18th century, there was a kind of loosening of social bonds, which led to all kinds of exploitation, and in the 19th century there was a much more settled public morality?
I'm not particularly convinced of the idea that there are peaks and troughs in morality. I think we are generally the same imperfect beings, but with modernity, with the Enlightenment, and indeed with an increasing degree of affluence, we have a greater capacity for choice and a greater degree of tolerance for the choices of others. That seems to me a good thing. As Professor Milbank called me a liar on air, I invite people to Google to check what I'm saying is right.
Okay, I want to ask...